Okay, so we are live now, but we won't start until 5:03, so we can just continue our conversations until then. It looks like you already have bookshelves set up, though.
I am essentially all unpacked. It was all like one day of just figuring out where everything goes. So this is like my shelf. It's all set up. That's how I like it.
That's fast.
Impressive.
Yeah, I deliberately packed my books in the exact order that I wanted them shelved. So when I opened the boxes, I was just like, lift, put them in.
Oh, that's nice.
That's
smart.
Impressive. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I never do that. It's just like chaos. It's just like, and then I open it and I'm like, who did this? Who did this to me? That's me. I did it to me.
You can always blame the dog.
I could. I probably should.
Apologies for the vacuum in the background.
No worries. The last place I lived, I actually had my novels in alphabetical order by author. And because it was a cross-country move, we had movers who packed everything, and they just, like, when we finally got the books out, it was just like a room full of books. And nothing was in order. Like, everything was mixed. Not even like the novels weren't separated from like all of the other stuff. It was chaos. I hated it. I still don't have it back. I just sort of grouped like, well, this is the beginning of the alphabet. I'm just gonna put it all together.
Right.
I still haven't done it.
That's quite a chore.
I'm always jealous of the people who can organize by color. Like, I would never find anything. I would never find anything.
No.
But I don't know, it works for some people.
Does it? Or are they just, performing? Is it just a look?
All right, I think we're good to go. So let's get started, right? So for those who are joining us, thank you so much. Welcome to OutWrite. This panel is called Bad Behavior, Queer Women and Fiction and Short Fiction. We have some awesome panelists for you. I'm just going to introduce them very quickly, and then we will get started. So no particular order. Kristen Arnett is the New York Times bestselling author of Mostly Dead Things, which was listed as one of the New York Times top books of 2019 and was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in fiction. Her short story collection, Felt in the Jaw, was published by Split Lip Press and was awarded the 2017 Coil Book Award. She's a Spring 2020 Shearing Fellow at Black Mountain Institute. And her next two books, Samson, a Novel, and With Foxes, Stories, will be published by Riverhead Books. Melka Older is a writer, aid worker, and sociologist. Her science fiction political thriller, Infomocracy, was named one of the best books of 2016 by Kirkus, Book Riot, and the Washington Post. She's the creator of the serial Ninth Steps Station, currently running on Serial Box, and her short story collection And Other Disasters came out in November of 2019. Ruth Hofre, did I say that right? No, I forgot already.
Hofre, Ruth Hofre.
Ruth Hofre, sorry, is the author of the story collection Night Beast, which was longlisted for the Story Prize. Her months-long interview series with the authors, editors, and curators of craft books, essays, and resources is freely available on the Kenyon Review blog. A graduate of Cornell University and the Iowa Writers Workshop, Ruth lives in Seattle, where she teaches at Hugo House and co-organizes the Fight for Our Lives performance series. Mecca Jamila Sullivan is an assistant professor of English at Bryn Mawr College, and she is the winner of the 2018 Judith A. Markowitz Award for LGBTQ Writers and the author of the short story collection Blue Talk and Love, a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and the Edmund White Award for Debut Fiction. A forthcoming scholarly project, The Poetics of Difference, Queer Feminist Forms in the African Diaspora, explores the politics of formal innovation in Black queer feminist literature, performance, and visual art. She's also at work on a novel. Okay, so just to get this started, I'm just going to talk very briefly about the panel itself, and then let you just have a conversation. So the title of our panel is Bad Behavior, which is named after Mary Gaitskill's short story collection. Mary Gaitskill made waves for her short fiction that was unapologetically sexual and erotic and focused on women. And our characters are shining examples of bad behavior in various ways, but they're also very straight and very white. So this is the only time I'll actually, have us go like one by one and talk a little bit. But just as an opening, can you tell us a little bit about what you write, especially in terms of short fiction, and then how you relate the topic of bad behavior in terms of your own work? I guess I'll just go by who's first on my screen. So Kristen, you're first.
Oh yeah. I feel like Captain Lesbian right now with the ship behind me. Ahoy. I would say, especially with regard to short fiction, I would consider what I write to be what I kind of have coined as like the lesbian domestic in Florida, specifically Central Florida. I also consider myself to be very much a regional writer and a Florida writer. Classifying like the bad behavior of characters in fiction, I guess would be like that's like maybe just the inherent messiness of human beings is what I find myself writing into like a lot in work, like messiness just in lots of different kinds of capacities, like bodily messiness, sure, but like the messiness of relationships, specifically in households between like women, is like where I find like a lot of like, I mean, if we're going to use like bad, because like, right, like these kind of like binary terms of like bad and good are like difficult to navigate, I think. So messy, I think, is how I would like characterize like people's like, because people like, it's very human to like have like messy choices and messy things happen. And that's like where conflict comes from. So I think that's what I try and write into oftentimes in my short fiction.
Thank you. Malka?
Yeah, I think in terms of bad behavior in short fiction, I'm just really resistant to doing the expected thing, whether it's a beat or whether it's a story trope, or even, I mean, I feel like I get so many editors' comments where I've put an unusual phrase and they say, oh, that's an unusual phrase. Why don't you use usual phrase? And I do not want to use usual phrase. If I did, I would have. And I want it to be different. I want it to be something that shocks people out of that idiom that we're always using, that is so smoothed down by use that we don't even notice it and it has no meaning anymore. So that's what I think of in terms of bad behavior. And I think it's so important, particularly in short fiction, because it's really easy to get caught up and you really need to make every word and every phrase count.
Micah?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, first of all, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I want to make sure I'm good. Okay. Yeah, I agree. I think, similarly, I'm always interested in characters who, defy norms, challenge expectations. Kristen, what you were saying about sort of the dichotomy between bad and good. I always think of Run DMC and, just sort of Black cultural lexicon in general, right? Like not bad meaning bad, but bad meaning good. And I think my characters are always really interested in exploring what's good about the transgressive, good as in pleasurable, but also, necessary, maybe even politically necessary. So I think that's something that my characters are always interested in. And then Malka, as you said, with short fiction, I also think it's interesting to think about what it looks like to sort of behave badly on the level of language and form, right? Using the unexpected phrase. For me, really trying to like mess with the bounds of what the short story is supposed to be or is expected to be and do is another, I think, way of approaching bad behavior for me in fiction.
Ruth?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of my work, I typically write like just about lesbians and nightmares. That's like my whole thing. It's kind of scary. You're kind of in love at the same time. It's like weird queer sadness. It's my whole brand, really. But in terms of bad behavior, I tend to I tend to think that, or keep in mind that bad behavior is different depending on who's looking at it, particularly if straight people are looking at it versus queer people are looking at it. Because, you know, straight people might see certain things that are very common in queer culture as bad or wrong or like against their belief system or religion or something. And I'm not writing for that audience, and I'm not writing for their opinions about my behavior or my character's behavior. So that's something that I'm always keeping in mind, that, you know, what might be considered strange or odd or off-putting is actually like really familiar to the people that I'm writing to, and I want them to feel seen in the kind of behaviors that I'm showing on the page.
So what I'm hearing is that, you know, there's this aspect of messiness that's involved, and then there's pushing against the expected norms of whether it's craft or whether it's how your characters behave. And then there's sort of leaning into the strange or the abject, right? And a lot of these can sort of feed back into what is considered bad behavior in our bigger culture. But I want to shift the conversation a little bit toward taking up space. So what does it mean to be a writer who engages in what culture might call bad behavior in some ways? You know, what is expected of a woman who's an author, and what is she expected to write? And then how do you sort of, you know, speak back to that? But also, what does it mean to you to take up space on the page and in the literary community as a queer person, as a woman? And then, you know, this is based sort of on Gaitskill as well, because she was, the reason why she was so lauded is because she was unapologetically taking up space on the page and in the literary community as a woman. So what does it mean to you to take up space in these various ways? And then, you know, we don't have to go, you know, down the line and answer the questions anymore. We can just sort of talk. So we can, you know, feel free to just speak up and continue the conversation. Anyone want to go first?
I guess I will just continue us in the order. I think as writers, just in general, we're always just, because we're not just writers, we're readers. If you're a writer, you're a reader. So we're constantly looking to read the thing that speaks to us. And so I think as queer writers, oftentimes for myself, because I won't speak for everyone, but for myself, I was looking to write the thing I really wanted to read and felt like I didn't have access to. So it's like, for me, it felt like maybe not like taking up space, but more like carving out the thing that I felt like I was lacking or like needed. And like so much of me writing queerness was like, I really want to see like I had a lot of thoughts about like the idea of like coming out narratives versus like, you know, just like everyday like lived queer experience like within the novel or within short fiction or short stories. And I was like, I'm really looking to see like the messiness just of a person that, like, you know, who is queer. And that's like the thing that I'm looking to see on the page, because as a human being, I'm seeing it in my own life, and I want to see that reflected like in literature that I'm reading. So I think it started as like trying to like write the thing that you want to read, I guess, is like maybe the most kind of like boiled down kind of like thought process behind that.
I write about the future, sometimes not, but mostly I write about the future, which is really about the present. And when I think about taking up space with my books, I think about when I wrote my book, I was thinking very much about the cyberpunk tradition, but I felt really, really strongly about making it a global book. And I wanted the book to be set all over the world. So there's something like 17 locations in the first book, and then more different locations in the sequels. And okay, that's novels. I should talk about my short fiction, but the short fiction as well. Like I try to make sure that the futures that I talk about are grounded in different places, that they're grounded in all different types of people as much as I can get out there, because like Kristen said, it's the stuff that we're missing from all the other books we read. All the places that are missing, all the people that are missing. And that to me is is taking up space. That is getting out there and putting all of the space that we can onto the page, and then being unapologetic about it when we're talking about our work in public.
I'll go next unless you want to.
No,
Yeah.
go for it.
Cool. So SJ, I think you asked in your question, like, what is expected of queer women writers? I think the reality is that silence is expected, like not existing is expected. Like Kristen, you were saying that you wanted to read this, like write the stuff that you wanted to read because it wasn't really out there. I had that experience too. Like, where were the books about like fat, queer, Latinx children of immigrants? Like, that's all of my intersections. I'm like, where are those books? They're not really that many of them. So I definitely wanted to write about that and write about those intersections, and to just combat the silence. I think also, speaking about literary community, all of those intersections that I talked about are all intersections that are easy to not see. Like, I'm light-skinned Latinx, light enough to be white passing. I'm not very queerly visible if I'm not walking with my girlfriend. So like, you can't see all of those different parts of me, or when I'm walking around, when I'm attending a reading. So I think it's really important when I'm within the literary community in person or online, or doing any kind of literary advocacy work or organizing, to be that unexpected ally in a room where it might be like all white people, all straight people, and I might look like I'm part of that, but I'm not. And I want it to be clear when I speak up that I'm, you know, like part of a different community than that. And to have, you know, if there's one other person in the room, I want to find that person and be that ally and be that friend. And to, I think historically, because I passed for all of these different things, I've probably also been given access to different places. Like, I'm thinking about academia. I went to Cornell, I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, and like was able to be places where I was the only queer person, I was the only Latinx person for large periods of time. And to be that person in the room and to have my politics, without looking like someone who might have those politics, was important, I think, because I was able to advocate for things that people weren't expecting of me, and to make people uncomfortable when they were expecting, you know, like some other person to just accept their racist, homophobic comments. And I think that was really important to me when I was working within the literary community, was just to continue that work of being an ally and of speaking up when silence is expected.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo, you know, a lot of what's already been said, especially what you were just saying, Ruth, about, you know, sort of the ways in which our bodies and the bodies of our characters can transform literary landscapes, but also the landscapes of literary culture. And definitely for me, you know, I tend to write about fat, Black, queer women, and you know, those whose lives sort of touch the lives of those characters. But certainly, you know, I think sort of having the opportunity to really like engage with characters whose fatness and whose Blackness and whose queerness are, you know, sort of inextricably linked, that they live through those intersections and their worlds are shaped through those intersections, I think is really, it's an important part of my creative interest, but also, again, my politics. And similarly, I think my, you know, thinking about how my fat, Black, queer body is hyper visible in a lot of spaces, making sure that I sort of own that hypervisibility, while also keeping my own well-being and pleasure in mind as I navigate those spaces, I think has been crucial. So I think for me, it's a sort of I can't really separate my creative practice from my sort of, you know, literary positionalities in that way.
I love what a lot of you said about, you know, just how our identities are either visibly marked or completely invisible in terms of like where we are and what space we're in, and how that affects, you know, what kind of advocacy we can do. in the literary community. I'm curious if you've ever, you know, in your careers, in terms of writing, in terms of publishing, in terms of being visible writers out in the world, visible queer writers out in the world, has there ever been a time when you felt like your identities were being questioned, or your like if you were being put in the category of bad behavior, whatever that means, right? Like where you felt either invisibilized or questioned in ways that have intersections of power.
So the thing I always think about is, I did a master's in English and creative writing, excuse me, before starting a PhD in English literature. And at the time, writing fiction absolutely felt like bad behavior. Like while I was working on this lit PhD, writing fiction felt like this thing I was not supposed to do, not supposed to talk about. Oh no, I'm frozen. Okay, sorry. I think that has changed to some extent, at least when I talk to students, and it's so great to see that. But you know, that's the kind of like challenging early career experience that makes you who you are, or whatever. You tell yourself that it was all worth it for that reason, because I do think that it has helped me to really embrace the connections between my scholarship and my, you know, sort of intellectual life, my activist life, and my creative life, and sort of refuse to make those separations. So it's become an important part of my intellectual identity, even as, again, it felt very transgressive early on in my career.
Does anyone else want to speak to that, or I have a follow-up question if you don't?
I mean, I think there's two, like, right, there's just those things in publishing that hopefully, I mean, we can see what happens with it. Because there's been like, especially recent, like upheaval and like, right, who is getting published, like who gets to have a voice and who gets to have a say, like up the ladder even in terms of like, because it's not just like who the people decide to publish, but it's who's in charge of like doing that publishing, who gets those like positions of power within publishing, like who gets to be an editor, who gets to be in those places. So I think like there were definitely times like trying to either publishing short fiction or like getting the novel published where it was like, oh, well, we just did that gay one. Like we just did that gay thing, or we just did that one that felt like, right, like, because it's like they already did like the check, like they checked the box off of that. So there was like that feeling of like, oh, you have to like prove yourself to prove that there's like an audience for it. But then like if trying to prove yourself when no one will like give you a chance to do that thing is very, right, like at odds with each other. So I really felt like so many times too, and maybe this is like my segue into figuring out, because I feel like a lot of times I need to ask a question a lot of ways to figure out what I actually think about something. That's just me, maybe as a person and as a librarian. But yeah, like so much of that too was like me second guessing my space, or like, you know, right, like myself and like my ingrained kind of things being like, first of all, being like, well, you know, like maybe internalized kind of homophobia at some point, being like, well, that other gay thing did get published, right? Like, let's like make sure that everybody gets to like, and like kind of second guessing myself. And then also in terms of like my wanting to be seen as like not a problematic queer person. It's like not like kind of like being like a problem. Like, so if somebody doesn't want it or says something to me that I think is maybe like a kind of way, and like earlier on in my career being like, that's cool, it's totally fine. Like I get it, and trying to be like super nice about it and being like actually a problem for myself in those kinds of ways, because I didn't want to like rock the boat or like make it so that people didn't saw me in a kind of way. So I don't know. Wow, that question has made me like think about things a lot. I guess now I'm like having like a lot of questions about this. That's I guess that's good. But yeah, somebody else please talk now, God.
I think I had a kind of similar experience in that, you know, I was questioning whether people were interested in my queer stories, particularly when I was starting out. It was like I was writing about poor queer people who were like just getting by, like really kind of slipping through the cracks of society, and people were always comparing my work either to Mary Gateskill or to Dorothy Allison. And I was like, I remember having a conversation with one of my professors and being like, is anybody going to be interested in this book in the publishing industry? She was like, well, it's so like Dorothy Allison, Bachelor out of Carolina. She did it. And I was like, that was like 20 years ago. Is she the only one who's allowed? Because it kind of felt like it when I was asking the question. It feels a little less like it now, but I think we are definitely, there's a lot more work to be done in terms of like opening up publishing and stopping the gatekeeping and just getting more voices heard.
I mean, something that you said a little bit earlier was really interesting to me, Ruth, where you talked about speaking toward the silence that's expected of queer people in general and queer women specifically. But there's the other side, right? Like where when a certain minority starts to get published, there are these tropes that are expected of you. So, you know, as a South Asian writer, right, like we're expected to write about these giant families and like mangoes and people in saris and like arranged marriages and all this stuff. So what is that for queer women's writing right now, do you think? Or maybe not even right now, but like, you know, over the course of your career, have you been expected to write about certain things? And then how have you either like sort of leaned into it or subverted it? And I mean, Kristen talked a little bit earlier about the coming out narrative being like the structure of the queer story, and that's supposed to be like the way you approach queer storytelling.
I do think it's like, I mean, it's a thing where it's right, because it's like a kind of weird duality of being like, right, like the art of making like a story or like some kind of narrative that like you're putting like a lot of yourself into and like trying to craft for yourself. And then there's the other side of that, which is like the weird publishing part of that, where it's like, well, what's saleable about you? What's saleable about this? And the idea that like there's so few, like even like what Ruth was saying about like Dorothy Allison, right? Like there's like, okay, well, you have to like have these like comps or some kind of comparable thing because they know that that's a thing that's sold. And then the people who are in charge of like making these like predictions about things are all like generally like much older cis white straight men, and being like they're the ones making decisions on what's going to be saleable for like a lot of different things, which I mean there's like right there's like the divide, because we all know that there's like so many like myriad voices and myriad things that so many people are like aching and kind of yearning for to see like representation for themselves in fiction, like short fiction, you know, like kind of seeing that like little slice of bit of yourself in a story is like so meaningful at any age, like especially like as like young readers, like kind of coming in and like seeing that kind of thing is like so meaningful. But it is like, right, because it's like there's this like, right, like making art and then saleability, and how those two things kind of come together is like constantly, I feel like, butting heads, especially when stuff's like already like so underrepresented. So like how do you say like, okay, yeah, I guess I am like Dorothy Allison, just so you like try and like make sales on a book? I don't know.
I feel like there's also a kind of a push towards the tragic, particularly with short fiction. And I feel a little like I'm not sure I'm not guilty of that myself, because I think my short fiction tends to be a lot darker than my novels, because I feel like I have to get emotion in that tiny package. And so, but I think that that's something, particularly when you think about underrepresented groups and how they're being portrayed, that, I certainly try not to have myself, to have the tragedy linked to that necessarily. And I think obviously there's a need for people to write their stories when their stories are tragic, but there's also, I think, a push beyond that that just says like, this is, the emotional and the meaningful and the heavy, and that's what should go into short fiction, and particularly Yeah, so I kind of like fun stories.
When I was growing up and coming out myself, I recently took stock of this and like what were the queer narratives at the time, and all of them fell into a coming out story, an AIDS story, a gay bashing story. It was like Matthew Shepard, Angels in America, and then like a couple of coming out like books, like YA books. There were just a few at the time. And that was like everything that was available to someone of my age. And like, and then the L Word came out and there was a little bit more representation. L Word was not great at representation at all. So those were the primary narratives. And I think it's really telling that 2 out of those 3 are by default tragic, and coming out stories at the time were pretty tragic too. So I think there was this expectation that queer stories were going to be sad for specific ways, mostly related to like hate and dying. And now a lot of my work is queer sadness, but because like love is hard and life is terrible. So different reasons, but also still sadness and tragedy.
Sorry, I was muted. I don't know why. Oh yeah, I know, because I'm on a main road and an ambulance passed by. Really loudly. Mecca, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, I agree with a lot of, with what's been said already. And I think, when I think about sort of what narratives might be expected of me as a queer writer, I think, yeah, absolutely, the coming out narrative, the gay bashing narrative. I'm glad that you mentioned the AIDS and HIV narrative. And I think I would add maybe a sexual violence narrative as well, which of course, all of these are real, right? And all of these are parts of real life, and are important parts of real life. And so I think, it's always been important to me to kind of hold together the complexity of those real experiences and the crucial importance of the context in which those experiences play out, right? That like these are parts of our stories and they might be really important parts of our stories, and yet they're never the whole story. And so, maybe like part of the bad behavior is to like insist on telling fuller stories, right, that include all of these expected experiences, but also do different things with them, and tell truths that are unexpected as well.
I really, sorry, I was like technical difficulties, just clicking on the wrong part of my screen. I love that as like because it is a thing I consider a lot of the time, thinking about, right, like the idea of like a coming out narrative, or these kind of like idea, like a moment in time, although we all know like coming out is like not like a singular instance, it happens like over and over again, but like that initial kind of coming out story, it's like this like moment in time of queerness, or like of a part of being queer. And then sometimes too, the idea of like writing very specifically into trauma feels like, or the expectation of like trauma porn, those kinds of things. Like sometimes I have questions about like specific kind of coming out narratives and who they're being written for. Because sometimes I don't feel like they're being written for like queer readers. They feel like they're being written for this kind of like voyeur gaze of the street audience, like wanting to have that kind of like, and now I can relate to it because I'm having like an empathy moment because I'm experiencing this trauma that's happened. So I do wonder sometimes like what the overwhelming need for them for, what, like who is it functioning for as an audience? Like, is this being written for like queer readers, or is it being written with this kind of overwhelming kind of thing? Like, this is what like people want to see because people like to kind of like watch the ambulance go by, not to say, like to bring it back to like what's happening. But it is a question I have, and I love the idea of like right, like because that's like what's the fullness of like the whole lived experience? Like, what does that like holistically look like? And it's so much bigger and broader than like these kind of moments that are pulled out that are important to conflict and narrative within like the structure of story and novels. But when we're talking about lives or like fully lived experiences, they're like so much bigger than that.
Muted again. Damn it. Okay, sorry. So I love that, like talking about what narratives are expected and what aren't, and how we complicate those kinds of narratives that are expected. So I'm curious about, in terms of publishing, or maybe a straight audience having an idea of what like the lesbian experience is, right? Which completely excludes bisexual people. It excludes usually like femme identified people, and then also, excludes all sorts of racial identity and intersections of ethnicity and immigration and ability and all of those things. I'm curious, like in your own work, how you've gone about sort of subverting all of these expectations, how you've introduced complexity into your characters. Like, is there a certain process that you have, or a certain example that sort of sticks out to you at the top of your head?
I think that we focus a lot on the main characters and how we nuance those, and I think that's talked a lot about. But I also try really hard to do it with like secondary and tertiary and those throwaway characters. If I ever catch myself, and I've caught myself a lot, writing some character and sort of automatically picturing them in a gender or orientation or ethnicity, I flip it. And it happens so easily. Like I can even remember one time I was writing, and I was going to write, someone was talking, and I wanted to flip, instead of them saying men and women, I wanted them to say women and men. But I was typing and I typed men and women anyway, because these things are so ingrained that like, even when you're thinking it, it sometimes takes the extra step, because they're, these things just flow, let alone, changing the parameters altogether. So, like one of my proudest edits that I've ever done was changing like a mother hen to like an emperor penguin. And I just think that those things are so much harder to find and catch, and yet they're so important, because like that's the backdrop of the books that has a huge impact, because it's so invisible.
One thing I've started doing more often, not all the time, I'm working on that, is to identify characters, call the white characters white, and not just let people assume that everyone's white. It's something that like sometimes it's really hard to naturally work in. So I'm figuring out how to force myself to do it when it's feeling unnatural to the sentence, because I have certain like rhythms that I've gotten into over years of not having to do that I have to unlearn. So I'm in the process of figuring out the best way to do that. But I think it's really important to throw that in a story, especially when you have characters who are queer and of color, and to then mention how many white people are in the background, it creates this like sense of malice and of being watched, almost, to have all of these white people in my like queer of color story. And I think that's a representation too of a lot of my experience, to suddenly be surrounded by all of these white people. Yeah, so I'm learning how to do that in my fiction better. And I think that's something that everyone should be doing more of.
I think I've been thinking about tropes and like cliches about like queer women. Like bringing up the L word is like very funny, I think, because it's like, right, there's these like ideas about like lesbian relationships or jokes about things, like even like within community, like we understand like these kind of like things like, oh, well, it's there for a reason, right? Like lesbians U-Haul, or like these things like turkey basters, or like stuff like that. Like there's like kind of like in like embedded things. And so a thing I've been trying to think about, especially when writing short fiction recently, is like to like dig into the trope and dig into like the underlying thing that's sitting there. Like, cause sometimes I am a person that like jokes around a lot, and like I enjoy like humor and use it like as like a kind of like mechanism in lots of ways, right? Like to like get to know people, but also as a kind of like a coping mechanism or like a deflection of different things. So like kind of setting that stuff inside of a narrative and like how can I like actually unpack this and like see the thing, because I think embedded trope, I've been thinking a lot about like the idea about like queer boundaries, specifically when it comes to like queer women, and like how like there's like this idea that, oh, this is a safe space because it's a queer space, when that's like not inherently true, right? Like how do those things like fit inside of like the actual narrative or lived experience, where it's like there's plenty of people inside like, you know, queer relationships where there's like, you know, Carmen Maria Machado writes so beautifully about that in that, like in the Dream House, where it's like, you know, there's like abuse within these relationships, or there's you know, there's definite problems with like kind of like not having boundaries, or these kind of ideas of things like that. So I've been trying to like put that into short fiction and fiction and like unpack it like through the work. And it's felt like a very difficult process, but it's felt like very necessary in these kinds of ways, right? Because there's so many things that are just kind of like part and parcel of lived experience. And we just are like, well, that's just how it is. And like, is that really like actually how it is? And like, what does it actually function as? Like, especially if we look at fiction through that kind of lens. So it's a thing I've been trying to be like, give way more thought to and maybe unpack, because like the joke itself is sometimes like, right, like is embedded in a kind of thing. So like, what does it mean to like unpack the joke or the trope and see what it actually means in fiction?
Yeah, I appreciate, you know, especially Mako, what you were saying about revision. In thinking about this and listening to what folks are saying, I think for me too, a lot of this actually becomes more conscious in the revision process. When I look at, you know, the throwaway lines, the throwaway metaphors, the throwaway, you know, sort of references, and especially when I'm working in a kind of more omniscient third person, because in the first person, the character gives me their perspective. And of course, most of my characters are all hyper aware of their own difference, which means like, you know, that's named. And the same is more or less true with like a more, you know, third limited. But in the third omniscient, I do catch moments where my own assumptions that, you know, I haven't really, you know, spent time working through come out on the page. And I think for me too, it is something that in revision, I'm working on a revision of a novel that was once in a third limited and is now in a more omniscient perspective. And so it's really, I am catching a lot of those moments. And there's something about that makes the process of revision sort of feel important and feel exciting for that reason too.
So who do you see as your audience? Do you see it as other people who share your various identities, or do you see it as, you know, you're writing for a more mainstream audience? And how do, you know, either of those things affect how you approach your own stories and characters?
I guess quite often I'm thinking about my audience as, right, because like we all know this, like not everybody's your audience, right? Mm-hmm. You know, this is people who are writers and also readers, right? Like tastes are like, what do we want to read? Like what speaks to us? For myself, so often I feel like I'm trying, like my audience in my heart, like, right, like who I feel like who I am and who like maybe I'm writing towards is like writing towards like queer Florida, because I do feel like a place writer. I do feel like I'm writing towards like home and like trying to unpack it in a lot of different ways. Like much as I'm trying to unpack queerness in my writing a lot of the time, I feel like I'm trying to unpack like how my feelings about Florida and like what it means to me as a space. So I also just think that too, because like so much of like the right, the literary canon of Florida as is has been like so white and male and straight, right? Like this idea of like kind of like weird Florida man. So it's like having like, I feel like I'm trying to sit inside of gay Florida and see what that looks like from a perspective, and then like, and it's been very interesting to me because this is maybe a thing. So like I feel like that is like the audience I've been like writing toward, because it was like myself writing to myself as like a reader, and then seeing how like other people have reacted to it who aren't from Florida, right? Like maybe they connect with it in these other kinds of ways. So I think the audience like envisioned in my head is like oftentimes like a microcosm of like the bigger whole. So I don't know. I mean, I think we write to like, we hope the work's gonna speak to somebody. But I think it's always like, right, like see who this like connects with, but I mean, you were ultimately writing for yourself, I think. I don't know. I'm speaking for me. I guess it's like, I don't want to speak like holistically about what that looks like.
I agree. I think, you know, I don't think a whole lot about who my audience is when I'm writing. And some of that is conscious, like some of it I really try to push onto the publishers. Like if they decide to publish it, it's their responsibility if nobody likes it. I'm writing what I want to write. And yes, like I'm going to try to sell it to people, but at a certain point, yeah, it becomes their responsibility. And I think the part where it gets kind of interesting for me is because a lot of my short work is commissioned, right? Either for an anthology or a website or whatever that have asked me to write something. And there, it's kind of a weird line where it somewhat feels like write for hire to me, like they are my clients. And so I'm trying to get something that works for them. And yet there are of course places where I will push back against that. So, you know, I am going to push back against translating Spanish words that are randomly in my English story, for example, because I guess the audience that I'm writing for is an audience with access to Google and they can handle it.
I think I said earlier that, you know, I tend to write more for the people who are one of my identities. And I usually have that in mind because I'm always, you know, writing with my own experiences in my toolkit. But I think particularly in the last few years, I've been writing more or been more aware that certain people are never going to pick up my book anyway. And I kind of think about like, I'm writing for the people who, a subset of people in the larger group of people who voted for Hillary would have voted for like Warren or Bernie, who are definitely going to vote Biden, like people who have some understanding of like basic human rights and are like right to exist and are willing to accept that. And I think that that is a subset of that like larger progressive movement. Like I'm never going to get somebody who votes for Trump to buy my book, except for my one awful cousin who bought my book anyway. It's like, why did you buy my book? You're not going to like it. You know, so it's just like, there are people who I am okay with never buying my book. I don't care. But I think there is a group of people within that larger group of like Democrats who would buy my book, and that's fine.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have all that much to add. I think, you know, my first thought is like, it is definitely true for me that I write for Black queer women, and in fact, fat Black queer women from Harlem who, you know, like to wear braids. I mean, you know, all of these are parts of my identity that matter to me. But I also think, I guess in the larger scheme, kind of as others have said, I feel like I write for people who need to read those stories as well. And that need, of course, is like for some a conscious need, right? That idea that, you know, you read what you need to see in the world. And a lot of us, we write what we need to see in the world. I think the same is true for readers. You know, a lot of readers might know that they're looking for the story of this particular character. You know, all of us and our cousins and, you know, are the folks who maybe not, they may not know that they need to read our books, right? Like, I think I hope they find our books anyway, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't necessarily write for them, but like, you know, they need them too. And I hope the publishers find a way to get our books to them too.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so we have about 10 more minutes. So I have 2 more questions for you. first one is so turning the attention away from your own work into what has inspired you. What are some stories or writers that have inspired you or given you some sort of joy to see unapologetic characters behaving in ways we don't expect?
I think just as like in terms of like, especially like current writing that, because I think we all could probably name like a million books that we love right now, but like in terms of like place writing that's like very unapologetically queer, Brian Washington's Lot, that short fiction collection that came out like last year, is doing so much like writing about like, I was just like floored, but it's like queer Black Houston, and like what like like what these stories look like and how they could like touch and connect each other and like have like such a strong voice in each of them. I was like, this is like the kind of work that I'm just like aching to see all the time, like to kind of see this like smart, beautiful writing that's like so embedded in place and home, and also like has like problems with it, and how does it like, how do like families sit inside of it, and how do different people sit inside of it. Like that's like reading that book felt like so significant to me, like just to see how beautifully like home and like queerness could be like put together. Also just like beautiful food narrative, which I think is always like so wonderful to like see in terms of like writing about place. But yeah, I think that specifically most recently for me. And also Alexander Chee, I think, writes queerness so beautifully. Edinburgh, I know it's not short fiction, but like as that novel, like it's like every time I read it makes me like weep, because it's like looking at, maybe it's not like bad behavior. I don't know. Like I think I'm having like a hard time with like bad is like the kind of like identifier, but just because I think like sometimes bad like denotes different or other, and so that's like I like the lyrical tenderness that like Alex G is able to bring to everything. So like especially Edinburgh. But I will stop because I will just like ramble on about like gay books forever. So.
Just what comes to mind immediately, I would say Sarah Pinsker, who has been doing amazing stuff, a short fiction and her novel, which came out last year, A Song for a New Day, which is incredible and very, very relevant and hopeful. And just really great characters that do unexpected things. And if I can include novellas in the short fiction, then also I'm just going to mention J.Y. Yang, who has some incredible and surprising, and there's a quartet of novellas that they wrote that are each one extremely different from the last, even though they're connected, and just really great stuff.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of the short fiction that's speaking to me most right now is speculative short fiction. And I was gonna say some names like J.Y. Yang, N.K. Jameson, but then a lot of people who I've been reading and been really touched by recently like don't have books yet. And I'm really excited for them to have books, because I feel like, these very like queer, non-binary people of color who are doing amazing stuff in the speculative fiction world, like for them to have books is in itself so radical seeming, after years and years of just like this white dominated publishing world. Like that would be amazing to me to be able to have their books. So I'm super excited for like, Alyssa Wong and Brooke Bolander and like all of these super cool speculative writers who just don't have books yet, but really should.
The people that come to mind for me for whatever reason are almost all poets. And I don't know what, I mean, I love poets and I teach a lot of poetry, but so the person whose short fiction I'm really kind of into right now is Dionne Brand. Her novels and her short stories, but she's also a phenomenal poet. Audre Lorde is like my just, end all be all, who is not a short fiction writer, although, you know, her essays always have this interesting narrative quality. There's a very much a kind of storyteller in her short prose, and I think obviously very much informed by poetry. And then a poet friend, Camila Aisha Moon, who is somebody who, you know, just is a stunning poet. Also, I think often she informs my way of thinking about storytelling, even, you know, despite the difference in genre. But yeah, I agree with also there are so many incredible voices that I think, you know, we're waiting to kind of see more broadly brought out into the world too.
Yeah, that's great. I love this, like all of the people that you mentioned, and then all of the people that, you know, will have books soon, or are like sort of up and coming writers. It's so important, I think, to give space and make space for the next generation of writers, which is nice. So we're almost out of time, but before we go, I would love to know what you're working on right now, and you know, where your attention is. I know we're in a pandemic and there's a lot going on, but you know, what are the projects that are happening for you?
I am right now working on edits for my novel that's coming out from Riverhead, and that's going to be like next summer. So like a year from now, whatever that's going to look like. But then also my short fiction collection coming out with them, which is still like kind of moving the pieces around, like, right? Like how short fiction collections are like so much of like putting the like, right, like the individual stories, but how they fit together, like puzzle pieces, like, right, like how they're supposed to fit, and looking at that. And then, yeah, just finally my brain feels like it started working a little bit again. I don't know, like I feel like it just kind of hit pause for a little while for a couple months maybe. Like just didn't want to do anything. Like even reading felt like really hard. So like when reading came back to me, I felt like kind of cried a little bit. It felt so like important to me. I'd missed it so much. But yeah, I just been like working on like new work, and like what will that turn into? I don't know, but it just feels good to like be able to like work and touch language and sentences a little bit again. Feels like really nice and important.
I'll go. I feel like I keep going last.
Yeah,
So I am working on revisions. So I'm revising a novel, also about a fat Black queer woman, and very much about sort of food and family and class mobility. And I'm hopefully in the kind of like late-ish revision stages on that. And then I'm also revising this academic book that's about sort of formal subversion, bad behavior, perhaps on the level of form in women's literary cultures of the African diaspora.
I'm working primarily on what I've recently admitted to myself is going to be like an actual collection of flash fiction. I've been doing this series for a while that I call the A Girl series. All of the stories are titled like A Girl Walks on the Moon, A Girl Turns to Stone. I had one recently out in Pink in their Latinx Lit celebration. So that's the most recent. And now I have like 15 or 20 of those out. And I'm like, okay, this should be a book. Just collect these, make it happen. So I've set a goal of doing that by like the end of next year. We'll see. I can't really focus on long things right now. So Flash is a good outlet.
I write about disasters a lot, both in fiction and in nonfiction. And so I've had a fair number of requests for pieces, and I've found that challenging. But on the other hand, I've been really enjoying digging into longer fiction that I was sort of pottering around with. And now it's like, I need to escape into a different world. And this is the world I'm going to escape into. And so, yeah, I have a couple of things that I find I don't want to talk about too much right now, but one that's, you know, very far in the process, and one that's less far in the process, and others that are much less far in the process. So.
All right, well, I think it's time to wrap up. It is right 6 o'clock. So thank you so much to our panelists. We can't really clap or give an applause. I guess we could do this. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our audience for joining.
Thank you, Sindhu.